Welcome, dear listeners. Today, we bring you a short story titled A Night of Passion. It was almost 10 p.m. when Marilyn finally finished her chores. She'd just settled into bed when she heard a familiar whistle coming from the edge of their property. It took her only a couple of seconds to recognize Hank's signal. Her heart skipped a beat. She shot up in bed, her eyes darting towards Stanley's room. Thankfully, he was sound asleep, oblivious to the nocturnal visitor. Marilyn tiptoed out of the house, her pulse racing. The night was pitch black, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. As she peered into the darkness, a figure emerged from the shadows of the oak tree by the fence. It was Hank. "Hank, what on earth are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a mix of annoyance and relief. "We agreed, no more coming over unannounced. You nearly gave me a heart attack." "Marilyn, honey," Hank whispered, stepping closer. "I thought Stanley was spending the night over at Kevin's. Figured I'd stop by and say hi." "He is at Kevin's," Marilyn said, her voice barely a whisper. "But that doesn't mean you can just waltz over here whenever you please. What if he comes back early? What if someone sees you?" "Aw, come on, Marilyn," Hank pleaded, stepping closer. "He's sound asleep. I just wanted to see you, hold you for a minute." "Hank, you need to go, now." Marilyn's voice was firm, though her resolve was wavering. "We can't keep doing this, it's too risky. We agreed, we'd only see each other when Stanley's out of town." "Just one kiss, Marilyn," Hank whispered, his voice husky. "I haven't seen you in days, I miss you." "Hank, please, keep your voice down, you'll wake the whole neighborhood." Marilyn glanced nervously towards the darkened windows of her neighbors' houses. "Just go, please." Hank sighed, sensing her fear. He switched on his flashlight and reluctantly turned to leave. All right, I'm going," he said, his voice tinged with disappointment. "But you better make it worth my while next time I see you." Marilyn watched him go, her body trembling with a mix of relief and regret. They had made a pact, a dangerous one, keep their affair a secret, but their desires were like a wildfire, threatening to consume them both. She crept back into the house, locking the door behind her. She'd known Hank for years, a casual acquaintance, fellow member of the Oak Haven Community Church. But their relationship had taken a dramatic turn a few months ago, fueled by loneliness and a shared hunger neither of them could deny. Marilyn had always been a good wife, a devoted mother to her two sons. She'd never even considered straying from Stanley. He was a good man, hard-working, kind, but their marriage had lost its spark years ago, their physical intimacy fading into a distant memory. Hank, with his rugged good looks and a roguish charm that belied his age, had awakened something in Marilyn that she thought was long dormant. He made her feel alive, desirable. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't seem to help herself. She'd told Hank repeatedly that he couldn't come to the house unless Stanley was out of town. Too risky. Tonight, Hank's sudden appearance had shaken her, reminded her of the precariousness of their situation. Marilyn was 48 years old. A good Christian woman. What on earth was she thinking, carrying on with a man like Hank? If Stanley ever found out, she shuddered at the thought. He might be a quiet man, but she knew him well enough to know that his anger, once unleashed, would be devastating. She had to end this before it was too late. But as she lay in bed, her body still tingling from Hank's touch, she couldn't help but wonder if she had the strength to resist the pull of their forbidden desire. If only Stanley were more attentive, more passionate. She sighed, burying her face in the pillow. It was no use. She was trapped in a loveless marriage, her desires a secret shame she couldn't share with anyone. She knew, in her heart, that if Stanley wasn't spending the night at Kevin's, she'd be making her way to Hank's fishing cabin by now. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard the back door creak open. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Marilyn, what are you doing out here? It's past midnight." Stanley's voice was sleepy, but laced with a hint of suspicion. Stanley flipped on the porch light, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He'd never seen Marilyn so jumpy. "What are you doing out here this time of night?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Something going on you need to tell me about." Marilyn's heart pounded in her chest. "You figured it out?" "It's nothing, Stanley. Just thought I heard something outside. Probably just a dog getting into the trash again." She forced a laugh, hoping to sound casual. "You know how I get. Always imagining the worst." Stanley wasn't convinced. Lately, you've been acting mighty strange, Marilyn. Sneaking out, whispering on the phone, coming home smelling like, well, I don't even know what. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. You better come clean, Marilyn, before I find out the hard way. Marilyn's mind raced. How much did he know? Had someone seen her with Hank? Oh, Stanley, you're being ridiculous, she said, trying to sound exasperated. You're letting your imagination run wild. It's probably just those new herbal teas I've been drinking. They're messing with my hormones, I think. Hormones, huh? Stanley snorted. Well, whatever it is, you better get it under control. People are starting to talk. He turned and headed back inside. Get some sleep, Marilyn. You're up early for church tomorrow. Marilyn went to bed. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and guilt. If Stanley had found out about Hank, he would have blown his top. Maybe he just suspected something was off, but didn't have any proof. She tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence. Stanley being extra suspicious tonight. Probably just stress from work, or worry about Kevin and Lisa. He was always going on about how they were spending too much money, not saving enough for a down payment on a house. Part of her wanted to confess, to end the charade and face the consequences. But the thought of Stanley's anger, of the shame and humiliation she would bring upon herself and their family, was too much to bear. And there was Hank. She couldn't deny the thrill of their secret rendezvous. The way he made her feel like a woman again. Stanley, bless his heart, was a good man, decent man. But he was also predictable, set in his ways. Their love life had become routine, perfunctory. Hank, on the other hand, was a force of nature. He was passionate, attentive, and he made Marilyn feel things she hadn't felt in years. She was 50 years old, for crying out loud. Shouldn't she be past all this, content with a quiet life of church socials and gardening? But her body, it seemed, had other ideas. Craved attention, yearned for a kind of intimacy that Stanley could no longer provide. She'd always been a plain, practical woman, her clothes chosen for comfort and durability, rather than style. But lately she'd found herself lingering in front of the mirror, trying on new outfits, experimenting with makeup. Even the gossipy women at church had noticed. Marilyn, honey, that dress looks real nice on you, Mrs. Henderson had remarked after Sunday service last week. You've been looking so radiant lately. Marilyn had blushed, mumbling something about a new vitamin regimen. But deep down, she knew the truth. It was Hank, with his lingering touches and whispered compliments, who had awakened a part of her she thought was long gone. The next morning, Marilyn told Stanley she was going to check on the fields. But instead, she drove straight to Hank's fishing cabin, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She found Hank down by the creek, scooping feed into his fish pond. Marilyn, darlin', you came. Hank dropped the feed bucket and rushed towards her, pulling her into a tight embrace. Marilyn pushed him away, her nerves on edge. Hank, stop it. What if someone sees us? She hissed, glancing around nervously. What's gotten into you? Acting like a lovesick teenager. It's only been a few days. Few days too long, Hank grumbled, his hands on her hips. Why you gotta be so uptight all of a sudden? What's wrong? Marilyn sank down onto the cot in the corner of the cabin, her face pale. I think Stanley's on to us, Hank. Her voice was barely a whisper. We gotta stop seeing each other. Least for a while. He came home late last night and caught me sneaking in. He was asking all these questions, saying I was acting strange, that people were talking. Whoa, slow down, Marilyn. What exactly did he say? Did he mention me? Did he say he knew about us? Hank's voice was laced with concern. No, he didn't say anything specific. But he was giving me that look. You know, the one that says he doesn't trust me. He even threatened to find out the hard way. Marilyn shuddered at the memory. Oh, Hank, what have we done? He finds out, He won't find out, darlin'. We've been careful. No one's seen us together, not that matters anyway. Stanley's too trusting, too darn naive to believe anyone would go after his wife. Hank sat down beside her, pulling her close. Now come on, give me a kiss. You're letting your imagination run wild. Hank, not now, Marilyn protested, pushing him away. I'm serious, this is dangerous. We have to stop before it's too late. Ah, Marilyn, you worry too much. Come on, just one little kiss, for old time's sake. He wiped his hands on his overalls and pulled her closer, his lips finding hers. Hank, stop. This is not the time. Marilyn pushed him away again, heart pounding in her chest. I came here to tell you we need to cool it. Cool it? What are you talking about, Marilyn? We're just getting started. Don't tell me you're not enjoying this, 'cause I know you are. Hank moved closer, his eyes burning with desire. Marilyn started to protest. The words caught in her throat. Look, Marilyn, I get it, okay? Stanley's a good guy, a church-going man. He'd never suspect anything. You just need to relax, enjoy yourself. I'm not asking for much, just a little fun. Little? Fun? Is that all this is to you, Hank? A little fun? Marilyn's voice was sharp, her eyes flashing with anger. You think I can just turn my feelings on and off like a faucet? I'm a married woman, Hank. This is wrong. I have to stop seeing you. But Marilyn, I thought we had something special. I thought you felt the same way about me. Hank's voice was soft, pleading. I do, Hank. That's the problem. I'm starting to feel things I shouldn't be feeling. Have to stop before. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Before what, Marilyn? Before you fall in love with me? Hank reached for her hand. Touch, gentle. Is that what you're afraid of? Marilyn stood up abruptly, pulling away from his touch. She couldn't deny the truth any longer. She was falling for Hank, hard and fast, and she was terrified. I need to go, Hank, she said, her voice shaky. Don't try to contact me for a while. She turned and walked away, leaving Hank standing by the creek, his face a mixture of disappointment and longing. Marilyn drove home, her mind racing. She'd made a decision, a difficult one. But deep down, she knew it was the right one. For now. Hank watched Marilyn's retreating figure, his heart pounding with a mixture of longing and frustration. He'd never felt this way about a woman before. Ever since his wife had left him for a highfalutin lawyer in Des Moines, he'd been living a solitary life, content with his fishing cabin and the company of his 2 dogs. Then Marilyn had waltzed into his life, all curves and sass, and turned his world upside down. It was crazy, he knew that. Marilyn, Stanley's wife, the preacher's daughter, the woman who always brought homemade pies to the church potluck. He never would have imagined. There she was, sneaking down to his cabin every chance she got, her eyes burning with a desire that matched his own. She was a looker, that Marilyn. Even at her age, she had a figure that could make a younger man blush. Those gossipy women at the quilting circle might have called her plump, but Hank knew better. Marilyn was voluptuous, all soft curves and womanly warmth. He'd first noticed her at the town fair last summer, watching her as she helped her daughter-in-law Lisa chase after little Ethan. He'd made a few harmless jokes, flirted a little, never expecting anything to come of it. But Marilyn, to his surprise, had flirted back. One thing led to another, and before he knew it, they were meeting regularly, their stolen moments becoming a lifeline for both of them. Even Marilyn's closest friends couldn't understand her infatuation with Hank. He was a rough-around-the-edges kind of guy, a widower with a reputation for liking his beer and his women. But Marilyn didn't care. She saw something in Hank that no one else did. Kindness, vulnerability beneath that gruff exterior. And of course, there was the undeniable physical attraction. They'd been seeing each other for almost 3 months now, their encounters becoming more and more passionate, more and more reckless. But Marilyn was starting to get spooked. Stanley, for all his naivete, was starting to notice things. He'd been asking questions, making comments that sent a chill down Marilyn's spine. She'd tried to pull away from Hank, convince herself that it was just a fling, a temporary lapse in judgment. But the more she tried to resist him, the stronger the pull became. At night, she'd lie awake, her body aching for his touch, her mind replaying their stolen kisses, their whispered promises. 5 days had passed since she'd seen him. 5 long, agonizing days. She thought she could handle it, thought she could put Hank out of her mind, but she couldn't. On the 6th day, she found herself driving down to the creek, telling herself she just needed to talk to him, to make sure they were on the same page. She'd parked her car by the side of the road and was walking down the dirt path that led to Hank's cabin when she saw him coming towards her on his old John Deere tractor. Marilyn! What a surprise! Where are you headed? Hank hopped down from the tractor, a wide grin spreading across his face. Haven't seen you around lately, missed you something fierce. Marilyn glanced around nervously, making sure no one was watching before she answered. Hank, you need to let go of my hand. What if someone sees us? She hissed, voice low. Have you lost your mind? We can't be seen together like this, not in broad daylight. Aw, relax, Marilyn. It's just us. Besides, you can't tell me you're not happy to see me. He leaned closer, eyes twinkling. You know I've been thinking about you all week. Didn't sleep a wink. So what's the situation at home? Stanley still suspicious? Hank asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I'm dying to know if I can come over tonight. No, Hank, it's too risky. Stanley's still on edge, and I don't want to push my luck. Marilyn sighed. I told you we can't see each other unless he's out of town. It's just too dangerous. Dangerous? Come on, Marilyn. Where's your sense of adventure? Chuckled. You know you're driving me crazy with all this waiting. It's not like we're kids sneaking around behind our parents' backs. We're grown adults. We can handle a little excitement. Hank, I know what we're doing is wrong. Can't help but feel guilty, especially when I look at Stanley. He's a good man. He doesn't deserve this. Marilyn looked down at her feet, ashamed. Look, Marilyn, I know this whole thing is complicated. Believe me, I'm not proud of myself for going after another man's wife. But you gotta understand, ever since my Betty passed, I've been lonely. And you, Marilyn, you're like a breath of fresh air. You make me feel young again. Hank reached for her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. Don't you feel it too? The spark between us? It's like something I haven't felt in years. Oh, Hank, you make it sound so easy. Marilyn sighed, her voice trembling. But it's not for me. I can't just throw away my marriage, my life, for a few stolen moments with you. I have to think about my sons, about what people would say. All right. I hear you, Hank said, raising his hands in surrender. I won't pressure you, but you gotta promise me one thing. If you ever get the chance, if Stanley's out of town again, you'll come see me, right? Maybe, Marilyn said softly, her voice laced with a mixture of hope and fear. Let's just see how things go. That's all I ask, darlin'. Hank smiled, squeezing her hand gently. Now get going before someone sees you here and starts spreading gossip. Marilyn turned to leave, her heart aching with a bittersweet longing. She knew she should stay away from Hank, knew that their affair was a dangerous game they couldn't win. But as she glanced back at him, his eyes meeting hers with a look of such raw desire, she couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. They parted ways, both feeling a surge of exhilaration. Hank was practically giddy, his blood pumping with anticipation. It had been a while since he'd had a woman in his arms, and the sight of Marilyn's swaying hips as she walked away rekindled a fire in him that he thought had long burned out. He wasn't much to look at, Hank knew that. Years of hard work under the sun had left his face weathered and lined, his hands calloused and rough. But he had something that those pretty boys in town didn't have: stamina, and a certain magnetism that women seemed to find irresistible. Marilyn was a prime example. What on earth did she see in him? He was twice her age, divorced, and lived in a dusty old fishing cabin. She couldn't seem to get enough of him. He'd teased her mercilessly when they first met, never dreaming she'd take him seriously. But Marilyn, to his surprise, had risen to the bait, her eyes sparkling with a mischievous glint that hinted at a hidden wildness beneath her prim and proper exterior. It had started innocently enough, a few shared glances at the church picnic, harmless flirtation over a plate of potato salad. But soon they were meeting secretly down by the creek, their stolen moments becoming more and more passionate, more and more reckless. Marilyn, for all her talk of guilt and consequences, was as hooked on Hank as he was on her. She craved his touch, the raw energy, the way he made her feel alive and desirable. They'd been seeing each other for almost 3 months now, their affair a secret they both guarded fiercely. But lately, Marilyn had been on edge. Stanley, bless his heart, was starting to notice things. He'd been making comments, asking questions, suspicion a constant shadow hanging over their clandestine rendezvous. Marilyn had tried to pull away from Hank, to convince herself that it was just a fling, a temporary lapse in judgment. But the more she tried to resist him, the stronger the pull became. Her body was a traitor, betraying her every attempt at self-control. She found herself daydreaming about Hank, her heart racing at the mere thought of his touch. Tonight, she had to see him. She couldn't stand another night alone. her body aching for his warmth, her senses starved, his scent. After a perfunctory dinner with Stanley, Marilyn went to their bedroom and changed into a new nightgown, one she'd bought specifically for her rendezvous with Hank. She brushed her hair, applied a touch of lipstick, and dabbed a little perfume behind her ears. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air, a subtle reminder of her forbidden desires. Stanley, sitting in his armchair by the window, looked up from his newspaper. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Where are you going all dressed up like that, Marilyn?" he asked, voice gruff. "It's almost 8 o'clock. You're not going to church this late, are you?" Marilyn forced a smile, trying to appear nonchalant. "I'm just going down to the community center, Stanley. The ladies' choir is having a practice tonight. Remember? I told you about it last week." "Choir practice? You? Since when are you interested in singing?" Stanley snorted. "And why are you all dolled up? You never wear makeup to choir practice." "Well, a woman has to have a little fun now and then, doesn't she, Stanley?" Marilyn retorted, her voice laced with a hint of defiance. "It's not like I'm going out to a nightclub. It's just choir practice. And besides, I can wear makeup if I want to, can't I?" "Don't get smart with me, Marilyn," Stanley warned, his voice rising. "You know I don't like it when you wear clothes like that. It's not decent. What would people think?" "What people think? Honestly, Stanley, you need to get with the times. This is the 21st century. I can wear what I want, when I want." Marilyn's voice was sharp, patience wearing thin. "Why don't you go back to reading your paper and leave me alone?" "You're being mighty disrespectful, Marilyn," Stanley muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't like you. You've been acting strange lately, sneaking around, whispering on the phone, coming home smelling like—" paused, sniffing the air, "like cheap perfume and—" "You're imagining things, Stanley, and I'm late for practice. I'll be back later." Marilyn grabbed her purse and hurried out the door, heart pounding in her chest. "Choir practice, my foot!" Stanley grumbled, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Where do you think you're going all dressed up like that?" But Marilyn was already gone, footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. She walked quickly, her head down, hoping to avoid any encounters with their neighbors. Every few steps she'd glance back over her shoulder, making sure Stanley wasn't following her. Soon she was on the outskirts of town, the lights of the houses fading into the distance. She followed the dirt road that led past the old cemetery and out towards the creek, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Hank was waiting for her, leaning against his pickup truck, a can of beer in his hand. A mischievous grin spread across his face as he saw her approach. He was ready. Hank spotted Marilyn's approaching figure in the distance and hurried towards her, his grin widening. "Well, hey there, beautiful. Anyone see you come out this way?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "What took you so long? I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." He gave her a once-over, gaze lingering on her curves. "You sure are looking fine tonight, Marilyn. What's the occasion? Trying to make me work up a sweat?" "Had to tell Stanley I was going to choir practice," Marilyn explained, her voice hushed. "He wouldn't let me out of the house looking like this otherwise. Come on. Let's go inside." "Why choir practice? Couldn't you come up with a better excuse? What if that old coot decides to check up on you?" Hank chuckled, shaking his head. "Should have told him you were going to a Tupperware party. Those things go on forever." "Oh, relax, Hank. He won't check up on me. He trusts me. Besides, he's too busy watching TV to notice what I'm doing." Marilyn rolled her eyes. He wouldn't know a real woman if she slapped him in the face. "You're telling me," Hank said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "So what are we waiting for? I've been thinking about you all day. Come here, you." He pulled her close, his hands roaming over her body with a familiarity that both excited and scared her. "Missed me, huh?" Marilyn purred, leaning into his touch. "You sure know how to make a girl feel special, Hank." "Special? Darlin', you ain't seen nothin' yet." Hank flipped on a lamp, bathing the cabin's interior in a warm glow. He stepped back, admiring Marilyn with a look of undisguised lust. "You're even prettier than I remember, Marilyn. Never thought I'd meet a woman like you, not at my age." "Oh, Hank, you're such a smooth talker," Marilyn said, her voice a husky whisper. "You make me feel like I'm 20 years younger." 20 years younger? Shoot, you make me feel like I'm 20 years younger. Hank chuckled, pulling her closer. If it wasn't for you, Marilyn, I'd probably be sitting here all alone, drinking myself into oblivion. You're a lifesaver, you know that? You're just saying that to butter me up, Hank, Marilyn said, but her eyes sparkled with pleasure. You don't have to worry about your wife finding out, do you? She glanced around nervously. What if she shows up here? Don't you worry about her, Marilyn. Betty's long gone. She hightailed it out of here years ago, couldn't stand living in this small town. And besides, she wouldn't dare show her face around here after what she did to me. Hank's voice hardened. She's the one who should be worried about me finding out what she's been up to. Well, it's not the same for me, Hank. Stanley and I are still married. If he ever found out about us... Marilyn shuddered at the thought. He won't find out, Marilyn. I promise. We'll be careful. Just you and me enjoying each other's company. What do you say? How about you stay the night? We can make a real night of it. Hank's eyes gleamed with desire. Stay the night? Hank, are you crazy? Stanley would kill me. I have to be home by 10. He'll be wondering where I am. They didn't waste any more time talking. Their eyes met, and the air crackled with unspoken desire. The long separation had only intensified their need for each other. Marilyn's defenses crumbled beneath Hank's touch, her body yielding to his insistent caresses. They fell into each other's arms, their kisses hungry and desperate. Clothes were shed, tossed carelessly aside as they stumbled towards the cot in the corner of the cabin. The night air was filled with the sounds of their passion, creaking of the old cot, their mingled moans of pleasure. They were like teenagers again, discovering the power and the glory of their bodies for the first time. Hank's calloused hands moved over Marilyn's skin, igniting a fire in her that she'd thought had long since extinguished. God, I've missed you, Marilyn, Hank groaned, his lips trailing down her neck. You're even more beautiful than I remember. You drive me wild. Marilyn arched her back, her fingers tangling in his hair, her breath coming in short gasps. Oh, Hank, you make me feel so. She couldn't find the words to express the overwhelming sensation that coursed through her body. You miss me, Marilyn? Hank asked, voice husky with desire. Do you think about me when you're at home, in bed with Stanley? Marilyn hesitated, a wave of guilt washing over. It's not like that, Hank, she whispered, turning her face away. Don't lie to me, Marilyn. I can see it in your eyes. You want me just as much as I want you. He pulled her close, his lips finding hers again. Tell me you think about me, Marilyn. Tell me I'm the only one who can make you feel this good. Oh, Hank, you're so good to me, Marilyn sighed, her voice trembling. I dream about you, Hank. All the time. I dream about running away with you, living in a little cabin by the lake, where no one knows us, where we can be together, just the two of us. We could do that, you know, Hank whispered, his voice serious for once. We could leave all this behind, start a new life together. You wouldn't have to sneak around anymore, worry about what people would say. Oh, Hank, you know that's not possible. I have a family, a life here. Can't just leave everything behind. But what about your happiness, Marilyn? You think you can live like this forever? Sharing your bed with a man who can't even? Hank stopped himself, not wanting to insult Stanley. Look, I'm not asking you to decide right now. Just think about it, okay? You deserve to be happy, Marilyn. You deserve a man who can appreciate you, a man who can make you feel like a real woman. Oh, Hank, please. Marilyn's voice was a soft moan, her body writhing beneath his. Don't talk anymore. Just do this to me. Sensing Marilyn's surrender, Hank poured all his passion and energy into their lovemaking. He was a man possessed, driven by a primal urge that belied his age. Marilyn, her body trembling beneath his powerful thrusts, held on tight, riding the waves of pleasure that washed over her in relentless surges. It was true what people said about Hank. He was a force of nature. Even at 52, he had a stamina that put younger men to shame. He treated lovemaking like a sport, a challenge to be conquered. No wonder Marilyn had fallen for him so hard. Stanley, poor Stanley, couldn't hold a candle to Hank's raw energy and unbridled passion. Over an hour passed, the small cabin filled with the sounds of their lovemaking, the creaking of the cot, their mingled moans of pleasure. Beads of sweat glistened on Hank's forehead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he didn't stop, not until Marilyn, her body spent and trembling, placed a hand on his chest, signaling her surrender. Hank, stop, I can't anymore, she gasped, her voice a breathless whisper. If you keep going, I won't be able to walk, Hank chuckled, his chest heaving. All right, darling, I get the message. You sure know how to wear a man out. He collapsed beside her, pulling her close. You okay? I didn't hurt you, did I? Marilyn shook her head, her eyes closed, a contented smile playing on her lips. No, Hank. You were amazing. I've never felt anything like that before. That's my girl, Hank said, his voice husky with satisfaction. Now that's what I call a good time. Not like that cold fish I used to be married to. She wouldn't know what to do with a real man. You really shouldn't talk about Betty like that, Hank, Marilyn said softly, tracing a finger across his chest. It's not very nice. Nice? Why should I be nice to a woman who walked out on me after 20 years? She didn't even have the decency to say goodbye, just packed her bags and took off with some lawyer from Des Moines. Didn't even leave a note. Hank's voice was bitter. Well, maybe she had her reasons, Hank. You were never home, always working, always. Marilyn trailed off, not wanting to hurt his feelings. Always what, Marilyn? Always trying to provide for her? Always trying to give her a good life? That's what she wanted, a big house, fancy clothes, a trip to Europe every year. She got tired of small-town life, said I was holding her back. Hank shook his head sadly. But you, Marilyn, you're different. You appreciate the simple things in life. You're not afraid of hard work, and you don't need fancy things to make you happy. Oh, Hank, you're making me blush, Marilyn said, her cheeks flushed with pleasure. Tell me something, Marilyn, Hank said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Has Stanley ever made you feel the way I make you feel? Hank, that's not fair. Stanley's a good man. He's just older, and he's been working hard his whole life. He doesn't have your stamina. Marilyn averted her gaze, ashamed of her betrayal. I knew it, Hank said, his voice filled with a mixture of triumph and sadness. I can tell, Marilyn, you're not getting what you need at home. That's why you keep coming back to me. He stroked her hair gently. Don't you worry, darling. I'll always take care of you. I'll make sure you never feel neglected again. Oh, Hank, Marilyn sighed, leaning into his touch. You make me feel. To what, Marilyn? Say it. How do I make you feel? Hank urged, his eyes searching hers. Marilyn sat up abruptly, a look of panic crossing her face. Lord, look at the time. It's almost 10 o'clock. I gotta go, Hank. Stanley will be home soon. He scrambled out of bed, gathering her clothes. Already? But it feels like we just got started. Hank protested, reaching for her hand. Don't go yet, Marilyn. Stay a little longer. Please? I can't, Hank. I really gotta go. If Stanley finds out I'm gone, he'll... Marilyn couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of Stanley's anger, of the shame and humiliation that would follow, sent a chill down her spine. Don't you worry, darling. Stanley's too clueless to suspect a thing. He probably thinks you're at choir practice, belting out hymns with those old biddies. Hank chuckled. You're safe with me, Marilyn. No one's gonna find out about us. Now come here and give me one last kiss before you go. All right, one kiss, Marilyn said, leaning in for a quick peck on his cheek. But then I really gotta go. You hear me, Hank? No more sneaking over to my place, and don't you dare call me unless Stanley's out of town. I mean it. You're the boss, darling, Hank said, his voice laced with a mock seriousness. But you better come see me soon, you hear? I can't live without you, Marilyn. You're my everything. Marilyn hurried out of the cabin, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She knew she should stay away from Hank, knew that their affair was a dangerous game, but she couldn't deny the way he made her feel, the way he brought her to life in a way Stanley never could. She was caught in a web of desire, and she didn't know how to escape. Marilyn dressed quickly, her cheeks flushed, her heart still racing. She kissed Hank one last time, a lingering, desperate kiss that left them both breathless. Then she hurried out of the cabin and into the night, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She drove home, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't believe what she'd just done. She'd betrayed Stanley, her husband of 30 years, the man who had always been there for her, through thick and thin. She parked the car in the driveway and tiptoed up to the front door, careful not to make a sound. He's probably sound asleep by now, he thought to herself, her heart pounding in her chest. Thank God for small favors. She slipped inside, locking the door behind her, and crept into the bedroom. Stanley was snoring softly, his face buried in the pillow. Marilyn sighed with relief. She'd gotten away with it again. But her relief was short-lived. A wave of shame washed over her as she looked at Stanley's sleeping form. How could she do this to him? How could she betray the man who had always loved her, who had always been there for her, no matter what? She undressed quietly and slipped into bed beside him, her body still tingling from Hank's touch. She tried to push the thoughts of their passionate encounter out of her mind, but it was no use. She was hooked, addicted to the thrill of their secret rendezvous, to the way Hank made her feel alive and desirable. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments and secret phone calls. Marilyn's affair with Hank had become an obsession, consuming her thoughts and dictating her every move. She was like a woman possessed, her desire for Hank burning with a fierce intensity that she couldn't control. Her libido, once dormant, reawakened with a vengeance. She craved Hank's touch, his rough hands, demanding kisses. She felt a boldness, a recklessness that she'd never known before. She even dared to bring Hank to the house, knowing that Stanley would be gone for a few hours, helping Kevin and Lisa with their new baby. "I just saw Stanley heading over to Kevin's," she whispered into the phone, her voice trembling with excitement. "He won't be back till after dark. You coming over?" "You bet I'm coming over," Hank said, his voice husky with desire. "Why don't you stay here at the cabin? Safer." "No, Hank, I want you to come to the house. It's more exciting." Marilyn couldn't explain the thrill she got from taking such a risk. It was as if the danger itself heightened her pleasure. "You're something else, Marilyn," Hank chuckled. "You're more of a wildcat than I thought. All right, I'll be there in 15 minutes. Get those curtains drawn, darlin', and make sure the back door's unlocked." "Don't you worry, Hank, I've got it all under control," Marilyn said, her voice purring with anticipation. They spent the afternoon lost in a haze of passion, their bodies entwined on the living room sofa, the curtains drawn tight against the prying eyes of their neighbors. They do this in the kitchen, their bodies pressed against the counter, scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filling the air. They even dared to venture into the bedroom, Stanley's and Marilyn's bedroom, making love in the very bed where Stanley slept each night. The risk, forbidden nature of their affair only seemed to intensify their passion. The days and weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and clandestine encounters. They met in motels, in the back of Hank's truck, in the woods behind the church. They couldn't get enough of each other, their desire a consuming fire that threatened to burn them both alive. They were playing a dangerous game, and they both knew it. But they were too caught up in the thrill of the moment, too blinded by their passion, care. Marilyn's transformation was startling. She'd lost weight, her skin glowed with a newfound radiance, and her eyes sparkled with a mischievous glint that Stanley had never seen before. She'd traded in her sensible house dresses, tight jeans and low-cut blouses. She even started wearing makeup. Bright red lipstick made her lips look full and inviting. Stanley, bless his heart, was clueless. He noticed the changes in Marilyn, of course, but he attributed them to a new exercise class she'd joined, or maybe to a vitamin regimen she'd been bragging about. He had no idea that his wife was living a double life, that she was spending her afternoons in the arms of another man who made her feel like a woman again. But there were whispers. People in Oak Haven were starting to talk. One afternoon, as Stanley was leaving the feed store, he ran into Jimmy Ray, his old fishing buddy. "Say, Stanley, you might want to keep an eye on your wife," Jimmy Ray said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I saw her down at Hank's cabin the other day. They were mighty cozy, if you know what I mean." "Hank? Marilyn?" "You must be mistaken, Jimmy Ray. Marilyn wouldn't." Stanley stopped himself, cold knot forming in his stomach. He'd noticed the changes in Marilyn, the new clothes, the perfume, the way she avoided his gaze. "Just a friendly warning, Stanley," Jimmy Ray said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You know how it is in a small town. Word gets around." Stanley drove home, his mind racing. He didn't want to believe it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He decided to keep a closer eye on Marilyn, just to be sure. He noticed that whenever he mentioned going to visit Kevin and Lisa, Marilyn would suddenly find a reason to stay home. and he'd seen Hank's truck parked down the road from their house on more than one occasion. Always late at night, when Stanley was already asleep. He confronted Marilyn, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Marilyn, I know what you're doing," he said, his eyes filled with pain. "You're seeing Hank, aren't you?" Marilyn's face paled, but she denied everything. She called Stanley crazy, jealous, said he was letting his imagination run wild. Stanley knew the truth. He was heartbroken. He didn't know what to do. One afternoon, Stanley had to drive to the county courthouse to file some paperwork. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Hank's beat-up Ford pickup parked by the side of the barn. He felt a surge of anger, cold knot of suspicion tightening in his gut. He got out of his truck, his movements slow and deliberate, and quietly made his way towards the house. Could hear voices coming from the kitchen, Marilyn's lilting laugh mingling with Hank's deep, gravelly voice. He reached the back door and stopped, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could see them through the window, Marilyn and Hank standing close together, their backs to him. Kitchen door was closed. Stanley's heart pounded in his chest. What were they doing in there, alone, with the door closed? A wave of nausea washed over him. He didn't want to believe it. The evidence was right there in front of him. Pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Marilyn and Hank turned, their faces pale with shock. "Stanley, you're home early," Marilyn stammered, her eyes wide with alarm. "Hank was leaving," Hank said quickly, trying to sound casual. "Just stopped by to check out your new piglets. Heard they were a prize-winning litter. Figured I might buy one off you next month." Stanley didn't say a word. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on Marilyn, his face a mask of barely suppressed rage. "Hank was just looking at the pigs, Stanley. Honestly, you're acting like—" Marilyn began, but Stanley cut her off. "Looking at the pigs? With the kitchen door closed?" Stanley's voice was cold, menacing. "What were you two doing in there? Don't lie to me, Marilyn. We were just talking, Stanley. Honestly, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Hank was just being friendly." Marilyn tried to sound convincing, but her voice trembled with guilt. "Friendly? Call this friendly?" Stanley's voice rose, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You've been seeing him, haven't you? Behind my back, all those late nights, all those excuses." "Now hold on, Stanley," Hank interjected, his voice calm but his eyes wary. "There's no need to get all riled up. Marilyn and I are just friends. We were just chatting, that's all. If you don't believe me, I'll be on my way. No need to cause any trouble." He turned to leave, but Stanley blocked his path. "Don't you walk away from me, Hank," Stanley said, voice low and dangerous. "I know what's going on. I've been a fool, but I'm not blind. You've been sneaking around with my wife, and I won't stand for it." "Stanley, please," Marilyn pleaded, her face white as a sheet. "Let him go. There's nothing going on. It's not what you think." Hank edged towards the door, his eyes darting nervously between Stanley and Marilyn. He'd seen that look in Stanley's eyes before, a look of a man pushed to his limit. He'd been lucky to get away unscathed. "You better watch yourself, Hank," Stanley warned, his voice cold and menacing. "Next time I catch you anywhere near my wife, you won't get off so easy. Pop, you hear me?" Hank didn't need to be told twice. Slipped out the door and hurried towards his truck, throwing a nervous glance back at Stanley as he drove away. Marilyn stood there, trembling, her face drained of all color. She'd been so close to being caught, so close to having her secret exposed. But Stanley, despite his anger, had let Hank go. He hadn't wanted to make a scene, hadn't wanted to humiliate Marilyn in front of their neighbor. He was a good man, Stanley. Too good, maybe. That night at dinner, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Stanley barely spoke, his gaze fixed on his plate, his jaw clenched tight. Marilyn tried to make conversation, but her words felt hollow, insincere. After dinner, Stanley confronted her, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. He accused her of betrayal, of lying to him, of making a fool of him. Marilyn denied everything, her voice shrill with defiance. She called Stanley paranoid, accused him of imagining things. But her denials were hollow, lacking conviction. Stanley knew the truth, even if he couldn't prove it. He was a broken man, his trust shattered, his heart ripped to shreds. He retreated to the living room, sinking into his favorite armchair, and turned on the television. the flickering images providing a welcome distraction from the pain that gnawed at his soul. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fix this. He loved Marilyn, had always loved her. But how could he ever trust her again? How could he ever forgive her for this betrayal? After that, Marilyn and Hank decided to lay low. They stopped seeing each other as often, their secret rendezvous replaced by stolen glances and furtive phone calls. They'd agreed to give it a rest, let things cool down at least for a while. It seemed their brush with exposure had scared them straight. Marilyn was racked with guilt, and Hank, for all his bravado, was starting to realize that their affair could have serious consequences. Not just for them, for Stanley and his family. But old habits die hard. A month passed, and the temptation proved too strong to resist. They started seeing each other again, this time more cautiously, more discreetly. They'd meet at odd hours in out-of-the-way places, their rendezvous planned with military precision. Stanley, meanwhile, was trying to rebuild his trust in Marilyn. He'd noticed that she'd become more withdrawn, spending more time at home, avoiding her friends and neighbors. She no longer went out at night, and her phone calls were brief and whispered. He hoped that their confrontation had shaken her, made her realize the error of her ways. Maybe it was just a fling, a midlife crisis, thought to himself, clinging to a fragile hope that their marriage could be salvaged. But his hope was shattered when one of the neighbors, Mrs. Peterson, mentioned seeing Marilyn's car parked down by Hank's fishing cabin several times in the past week. That Marilyn, she sure is spending a lot of time with Hank these days, Mrs. Peterson had said, voice laced with a knowing smirk. Wonder what Stanley thinks about that? Stanley knew exactly what he had to do. He called Jason, his oldest son, and asked him to come home for the weekend. He told Jason he needed help fixing the roof, but Jason knew his father well enough to sense that something was wrong. When Stanley told Jason about his suspicions, Jason was furious. Couldn't believe his mother would do something so reckless, so hurtful. We have to catch them, Dad, Jason said, his voice grim. We have to make them pay for what they've done. The next morning, Stanley told Marilyn he was going to Des Moines to help Kevin and Lisa with their new baby. Lisa called, said the baby's been fussy all night. She needs a break, and Kevin's gotta work. Stanley looked at Marilyn, his gaze steady, unreadable. You want to come with me? It's been a while since you've seen the grandkids. Oh, you go on ahead, Stanley, Marilyn said quickly, busying herself with the dishes. Someone's gotta stay here and feed the chickens. I'll come up next week, maybe. All right, suit yourself, Stanley said, his voice flat. I'll be back tomorrow night. As soon as Stanley was out of sight, Marilyn rushed to the bedroom and changed into her favorite blue dress, the one Hank always complimented her. She applied a fresh coat of lipstick, dabbed a little perfume behind her ears, and hurried out of the house. She didn't notice the dark sedan parked down the street, its windows tinted, engine idling. She didn't see Stanley and Jason watching her from the back seat, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Marilyn drove straight to Hank's cabin, her heart pounding with anticipation. She couldn't wait to see him, feel his arms around her, to forget about everything else for a while. She parked her car by the creek and walked towards the cabin, a smile spreading across her face as she saw Hank standing on the porch, waiting for her. She didn't see Stanley and Jason emerge from the trees, their movements silent and predatory. She didn't hear the back door creak open behind her. She didn't realize her secret was about to be exposed, her life about to change forever. They were waiting for her inside the cabin, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a rage that would consume them all. Marilyn's cry of surprise was cut short as Stanley and Jason burst into the room, their fury unleashed like a storm. The scene that unfolded was one of chaos and violence. Hank, caught off guard, tried to defend himself, but he was no match for Stanley's rage and Jason's youthful strength. They beat him mercilessly, their fists pounding into his flesh, their anger fueled by years of pent-up frustration and betrayal. Marilyn, stripped bare, her body exposed for all to see, could only cower in shame, her tears mingling with Hank's blood. She'd never felt so humiliated, so utterly degraded. She'd risked everything for a few moments of stolen pleasure, and now she'd lost everything. Her marriage, her family, her reputation. She begged Stanley to forgive her, her words choked with sobs. But Stanley, his heart broken, his trust shattered, couldn't even look at her. Jason, his anger spent, his face pale with disgust, turned away, unable to bear the sight of his mother's shame. In the end, it was Stanley, the quiet, gentle man she'd betrayed, who showed her mercy. He didn't call the police, didn't press charges against Hank, simply told Hank to get out of town and never come back. And then he turned to Marilyn, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut deeper than any blow, and said, "Get dressed, Marilyn. We're going home." They drove home in silence, the weight of Marilyn's betrayal hanging over them like a dark cloud. Stanley never spoke of that night again. He never forgave Marilyn. Not truly. But he stayed with her, for the sake of their sons, for the sake of the life they built together. Marilyn, haunted by the memory of her betrayal, retreated into a shell of her former self. The laughter had gone out of her eyes, replaced by a dull ache of regret. She'd learned a hard lesson, a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her days. The affair was over, but its consequences would linger forever. And that, dear listeners, is the end of our story. Story of betrayal and forgiveness, passion and regret, of the enduring power of love and the devastating consequences of loss. We hope you found it thought-provoking, perhaps even a little bit heartbreaking. Until next time, dear listeners, take care and sleep well.